I'm Jennifer Perusini. I am the founder and CEO of Neurovation Labs, which is a New York-based biotech startup. We are developing the first and only objective diagnostic and companion targeted treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I think I was always interested in science. I remember in kindergarten, looking at earthworms, and I loved it. But I also had a bunch of other interests too. Like I did dance and gymnastics, and I loved art and painting. It's also just very studious. So no matter what subject, I needed to get that A. It's the kind of pressure I put on myself even as a kid. So I would say, yes, I loved science, but I loved all the other subjects. I think when I started really getting into this field, it's really more of a personal thing. And by this field, I mean like fear neuroscience and PTSD. So I, lifelong New Yorker, I lived through, the aftermath of 9/11. And where I grew up, about 30 minutes north of Manhattan, we had such a high number of first responders lose their lives in the days after the attacks. So I watched people in my community lose their loved ones, their brothers, sisters, parents. And at the same time, I had lost my mother, my grandfather, and even my dog, all in that same month surrounding 9/11. So I started seeing how some people really lost their way after such a horrible tragedy, and how some people thrived and threw themselves into their work and into their hobbies. And I wanted to know why. What was going on in the brain to make us so different and have such different coping skills? So that's really when I got into studying fear and the brain and PTSD. My major in college was neuroscience and behavior. I went to Barnard College, which is the all-women's college of Columbia University. And then right after graduation, I made the trek out west to UCLA. That's where I did my doctorate. And that was also in behavioral neuroscience, really interdisciplinary within the neuroscience and psychology departments. So it was really great. And in graduate school, I had this preclinical rodent model of PTSD, and that's where I really got into the nitty-gritty of studying the brain and how these fear memories are held there. Did the experiences prepare me? Especially in this country, schooling is not necessarily amenable to leaving academia, especially when you go to get your PhD. The typical track is professorship and running a lab. And in college, unless you go to business school or take business classes, I'm not sure I knew how to translate my neuroscience knowledge into running a business. Just recently, the past academic year, I became chair of my college's entrepreneurs network. So really to start bringing entrepreneurship to campus and start teaching people about business and the skill set they need to go off on their own with their good ideas. So yes and no. Neurovation Labs was really born out of my research. We essentially discovered a brain biomarker of PTSD. This protein in the fear center of the brain we see is basically elevated stably after a traumatic event. And now we are leveraging that discovery to develop both the diagnostic and the treatment for PTSD within the company. This wasn't something that I thought I would ever do. I always saw myself going more into industry, like a pharmaceutical company, but we just saw such translational aspects of the research. So after my short postdoctoral fellowship, I decided to just go out on my own and see if I could start the company. And I did this with my past doctoral advisor, as well as a friend who's both an engineer and a patent lawyer. The main goal, not just with the company, but I think in my whole career, is to revolutionize mental health care. I view mental health disorders and psychiatric disorders as physical disorders with physical underpinnings. And we should be able to, diagnose and treat them with accuracy, just like we would, strep or even more timely, like COVID, right? We have tests for COVID to make sure it's not the flu or the common cold. Another goal, especially now as I'm working more with the military, is to end the stigma on mental health. It's such a part of our culture that it needs to be addressed. And if we don't address it, we'll never find meaningful solutions. So with the company, we have both the diagnostic and the treatment. They're separate product development tracks, but they go hand in hand. The diagnostic is a radio tracer to be used in something like a PET scan, where we can visualize the biomarker in the brain. And then the treatment targets that same biomarker and will bring it back down to baseline levels. So I wear many, many hats. I went from pure neuroscience research to doing everything. I'll still analyze data in our labs, but I don't actually work in the lab or do research in the lab. And that is one, because we actually contract out our research. So I'm based in New York, but we have labs spread across the country. And it's also good quality control and quality assurance to have external labs run some of the research. So I'll still analyze some of the data from those labs. I'm constantly speaking at conferences, constantly taking investor calls and meetings and writing emails. You're never not fundraising as a startup. I'll be communicating to my program managers at the Air Force and the Army. And lately, I've been very busy attending the programming for my Army Accelerator program in the afternoons. Just always reading new scientific papers and keeping up with the competition, and always communicating to my team and my board and delegating, reviewing contracts. I feel like I'm sometimes a lawyer too, so I do a lot. I really enjoy what I do, and I am very lucky that I am flexible in that I can really work from anywhere. I have worked from home long before COVID, and I travel to the labs and travel to conferences, but my home base is really in my New York City apartment. So I can take the work anywhere. And so when there's an opportunity to travel and spend more time with my husband and my family, I take it and I just take work on the road. On the flip side, I'm never not on the clock. So if we happen to go away for the weekend and I get a work email, I have to take it. But that doesn't really bother me. I know that's not for everyone. It's just that I really love what I do. So combining, adventure and seeing a new place in the world and still keeping up with my work is actually more relaxing than just turning everything off and laying on the beach somewhere. So I think it depends. As long as you love what you do and you don't mind taking it with you, then you can definitely strike a balance. I think that I really just like being the boss. I like having control over my own schedule, and it's such a cool experience to just not have any boundaries. If I want to explore, a new research avenue, I can, as long as there's funding for it. If I want to pivot, I can. And I also enjoy wearing all those hats and working in every aspect of the company, because I've learned so many new skill sets that I don't think I would have necessarily, continuing work in a lab. It is incredibly cutthroat to be in business. I think, one, you really have to be willing to pivot and be flexible. The biotech world changes all the time with what's hot and what's not. In the very beginning, when I started my company, it was right around the time that a very infamous diagnostic company went under and was under huge fire. And so no one was interested in my diagnostic product. But now, in the post-COVID world, everybody wants an objective diagnostic for every disorder. So you have to be willing to pivot and be flexible. And you also have to really have a tough skin. Throughout the years with investors, and you hear no a lot, there's no sugarcoating and people tell you how it is. So I've learned to take all criticism with, just in stride, and try to use everything as a learning experience, even if the feedback isn't given in the most positive way. But everything is really a learning experience. I don't have any, pharmaceutical, like big pharma experience, but just working in a startup and working in an academic lab is incredibly different. I think there's a lot more red tape and bureaucracy in academia. You are always working for someone. Even with, running your own lab, there's always somebody to answer to, whether it's the university or your grants or the government. That's not to say that there isn't any red tape in the company as well, especially now that we do have government contracts. There are people to answer to. But I think there are similarities as well. I feel like in both startup world and academic world, there's this shared passion to get your work done and, really caring about the underlying goals of, whatever disease model you're studying. So I think it is so important to be flexible. I know I keep saying that, but you never know when you have to pivot. And, just keeping up with the current biotech climate and what's interesting and fundable at the time. I think it's also important to be incredibly extroverted, or at least be able to turn it on at the appropriate time, like turn on that bubbly side and learn how to exude tons of confidence, because something that I've learned, especially early on, is that investors invest in you and the team, and not necessarily just the product that you're trying to make. So confidence is so important. And then again, having that tough skin and learning to take criticism. At least with neuroscience, I always tell people to just go for it. I think it's the most amazing field. And it's relatively new in terms of, scientific subfields. There's so much left to be discovered in the brain, and there's so much translation that can happen to the clinic. I think in combining with entrepreneurship, I've actually been giving this advice out a lot lately. It's become a very popular question. I think, you walk a fine line if you go into, say, grad school wanting to discover something. We all want to make contributions, but that just creates such added bias to your studies. And you can't go in thinking that you're going to, find something groundbreaking and turn it into a company. I think it's a recipe for disaster. I think, because there's such a spotlight on smaller biotech companies these days, post-COVID, that, you can get involved, maybe intern at a startup to see what the day-to-day is like. I think a lot of people would be surprised what, little research actually goes on and how much business there is to learn. See if you can attend programming like in your region for startups. They're very open to all different, people at all different levels of expertise. For example, in New York, they have things like biolabs, which have very cheap or free seminars and networking events for people that are, interested in science, but are much more business minded. I don't necessarily recommend going to grad school and getting your doctorate. I think it's always a valuable degree, but I think, if you like the business side more, business school is great. And if you like science and want to learn how to protect your assets, law school is great. So there's so many different options. It is so rewarding in so many ways. I always give the advice to, work as hard as you can on something in your life, but make sure you enjoy it. And I love being able to be a trailblazer in a field, where there's so much left to discover. And, I'm so passionate about, PTSD and solving the mental health crisis, that any contribution that I could make is, good enough for me, that I've done my job. So, STEM is just, there's so much you could do with it. You can be an academic scientist, you can be a lawyer, you can be a business person. And, science is the basis of life. And just being able to contribute to that is so exciting. It's just such a huge body of knowledge that we get to contribute to.